The presentation of Maija Timonen now and the response of Hito Steyerl, and then we would like to create a common discussion about all the presentations and also in the context of what happened and what was discussed till now in the conference. So Maija, she will talk half an hour. And
yeah, about half an hour. Could I actually have the lights a bit dimmed for my presentation, just for the whole thing? Yeah, that's great, thanks. Okay, that's the title of my presentation, which isn't the title of my PhD project. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start the presentation by giving a short description of my PhD project, which I finished about a year ago. But what I'm mainly hoping to use the 30 minutes for is to maybe test out some of the ideas that appeared in the PhD and where they could be taken outside of the perhaps quite self-contained context of the project. I will go on to describe a film project that I'm currently working on and unpack some of the ideas behind it, and also show visual research, quite sort of scattered images and found clips from films that I think somehow relate to what I'll be talking about. Hopefully something might crystallize about the project that will help me move on with it, but the presentation should also constitute an object in itself, a kind of film-like montage of ideas, but not a paper that puts out any particular argument. I guess if I'd have to describe it, is that it falls between two projects, a completed one, the PhD, and one yet to be realized, the film, and charts a possible path between them. And though I won't be showing any of my actual artwork or films because of the time limitations, I hope the presentation, well, I've approached the presentation in a way that might give some kind of idea of how I go about making my work. Actually, is it possible to get the lights a little bit dimmer as well? It's very bright. Thank you. The starting point for my PhD was a paradox, that of oppressive freedom. Capturing the way neoliberal rhetoric combines individual freedom with self-administration, this paradox could be also descriptive of an experiential landscape of work in the cultural field. Consisting of written thesis and a short film called The Debtors, the project adopted a self-reflexive approach and considered the possibilities for having a critical practice within this landscape, with a specific focus on what this might mean in the context of making films or doing a fine art practice-led PhD. The PhD dealt with this inquiry through looking at notions of authorship as they arise in contemporary institutional art environments and phrasing these according to tension between forms of collective authorship and a seeming persistent need for heroic figures of authorship if said environments are to act as a professional context. I will not be addressing these questions of authorship today, but rather have selected a specific section of the PhD to revisit and see how its themes have filtered into the film project I'm currently working on. The first chapter of my PhD thesis attempted to relate the fine art PhD to a broader context of an increasing commercialization of education, and discussed this through the metaphor of suspension derived from Hito Steyerl's film Lovely Andrea, as well as through a discussion of the formal aspects of the film itself. Without going too far into explaining what happens in the film, it starts out with her searching for a bondage image of herself taken in Japan in 1987 and moves on to follow the rope bondage of Asagi Ageha, a young woman who practices self-suspension, tying and suspending herself in air with ropes. My chapter contained a suggestion that in a faltering economic climate, particularly for artists, education and academic context could come to be seen as a way of deferring the fall, a state of suspension or perhaps a waiting room of sorts. And I hope that this could sort of only constitutes a kind of using and loving of the actual film and doesn't fall into the use and abuse category to make this connection. This suggestion of the relative safety of the academy in comparison to depleting funds for artists outside of it has been disproven by subsequent developments, or rather the waiting times were shorter than anticipated. I think we've all been here sort of talking from the specific contexts that we're familiar with and where we come from, and but I would say that this is definitely the case in Britain, with the government imposing 40% funding cuts to universities and tripling of tuition fees. But regardless of these developments, there was still something I felt was resonant about this suspension metaphor, and this was to do with it being crucially foregrounded in Steyerl's film as self-suspension, a self-administered discipline. This self-suspension, being your own bondage master, is a double-edged sword, one that dangles, to quote an article written by Kirsten Starkemeyer, in tension between the dependency implied by bondage and the independence the performer experiences through its practice, end quote. So self-suspension is an adoption of position of mastery, but also an internalization of authority. This could be linked to the self-administration and self-discipline required when working as a freelancer, but also to and only as a manifestation of a broader phenomena of the flexibilized labor market with its different strata of precarious workers. An anecdotal connection, or perhaps a formal similarity, could also be drawn to the process of doing an art PhD. As a relatively new academic discipline, there are less of an accepted academic model against which they are assessed, and therefore arguably more freedom to administer your own discipline. I discussed the model of subjectivity that could be seen to arise from this self-suspension metaphor in relation to, in my thesis that is, in relation to Adorno and Horkheimer's description of the bourgeois subject in their Dialectic of Enlightenment and in its chapter on Odysseus. Odysseus triumphs over mythical forces through cunning. He gets out of trouble by deceiving his supernatural opponents, and this often happens through feigning weakness or compliance to the rules of his opponent, and graduates into a form of self-sacrifice that guarantees survival. As a story of the self, Odysseus' travels uncover it as being predicated on its own erasure. His encounters with mythical beings narrate the inception of the modern subject, how the dynamic of a negotiation between the powers of God and nature persists as the model of domination and subjection in capitalist society, as man's relation to himself, but also between men. They write, "The deception of God carries over smoothly into that practiced by the disbelieving priests on the believers." This, I think, touches on the demands made by austerity measures on ones who suffer from that, in that these demands, for all their blatantness and hard-hitting language, are really made surreptitiously and depend on people's internalization of a need for self-control and the rational ability to forfeit enjoyment, endure pain now in order to reap benefits later. The deceit of the priest is repeated in the slyness of the way these demands insinuate themselves into a popular unconscious, for want of a better word, and is consummated in the eventual absence of any benefit